What if the deadliest weapon of World War I wasn't something you could see? Not a bullet. Not a bomb. Not even an explosion. But something invisible, something that entered your lungs, burned your body, and turned the air itself into a weapon. World War I began in 1914. At the time, people believed it would be a short war. Soldiers marched proudly through the streets. Families waved goodbye with smiles, not knowing what was coming. Many thought it would all be over within a few months. Some even said, "We'll be home by Christmas." But they were wrong. The war quickly turned into a nightmare. Instead of fast victories, it became a long, brutal stalemate. Across Europe, both sides dug deep trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles. These trenches became home to millions of soldiers. Life inside them was unbearable. The ground was always wet and muddy. Sometimes the mud was so thick it could trap a man in place. Rats crawled everywhere, feeding on leftover food. And sometimes on dead bodies. Disease spread easily. The smell of death never left. And above all, there was fear. Every time a soldier climbed out of the trench, he risked instant death. Machine guns could fire hundreds of bullets per minute, cutting down entire groups in seconds. Many soldiers died without even seeing the enemy. So both sides became stuck. Neither could move forward. Neither could win. And in war, being stuck is dangerous. Commanders grew desperate. They needed a way to break the deadlock. They needed something new. Something powerful enough to force the enemy out of their positions. That desperation led to one of the darkest decisions in human history. In April 1915, near the town of Ypres in Belgium, something unusual appeared on the battlefield. A strange green-yellow cloud began to rise and drift slowly toward Allied trenches. At first, soldiers didn't react. They had never seen anything like it before. It looked almost harmless. Like fog moving across the ground. But it wasn't fog. It was chlorine gas. As the cloud reached the trenches, everything changed. Soldiers began coughing violently. Their eyes burned as if filled with fire. Their throats tightened, making it impossible to breathe. Some tried to run, but panic made it worse. Others collapsed where they stood, clutching their chests, gasping for air that would never come. Chlorine gas reacts with moisture inside the lungs and forms acid. It doesn't just suffocate you, it destroys your body from the inside. Soldiers later described the experience as drowning, but on dry land. Thousands of men fled in terror. The defensive line broke almost instantly. And that moment changed warfare forever. Because once chemical weapons were used, there was no going back. Soon, both sides began developing their own gases. The goal was simple: create something even more deadly. Chlorine gas was only the beginning. Next came phosgene gas. This gas was far more dangerous, not because it acted quickly, but because it didn't. When soldiers inhaled phosgene, they often didn't realize it. There was no immediate pain, no strong warning. Maybe just a slight cough or irritation. But inside their bodies, the damage had already begun. Hours later, their lungs would start to fill with fluid. Breathing became harder and harder. Slowly, painfully, they would suffocate. By the time symptoms appeared, it was already too late to save them. Phosgene was responsible for a huge number of gas-related deaths in the war. But even that wasn't the worst weapon created. Then came mustard gas. And this is where the true horror begins. Mustard gas didn't just attack the lungs, it attacked the entire body. It caused severe chemical burns on the skin, forming large, painful blisters. It damaged the eyes, often causing blindness. It destroyed internal organs. And unlike earlier gases, mustard gas didn't disappear quickly. It could stay on the ground, on clothing, and on equipment for days. That meant even after an attack ended, the danger remained. Soldiers could walk into an area hours later and still be poisoned without realizing it. Imagine stepping into a battlefield where the air can kill you, the ground can poison you, and you don't even know where the danger is coming from. That was the reality of World War I. To survive, soldiers were given gas masks. But early masks were far from perfect. Some were uncomfortable. Some blocked vision. Others didn't fully protect against stronger gases. And in the chaos of battle, reaction time was everything. When a gas alarm sounded, soldiers had only seconds to put on their masks. If they were too slow, even for a moment, they were exposed. Some soldiers slept with their masks on. Others carried them everywhere, never letting go. The fear was constant. Because gas didn't follow rules. It moved with the wind. A sudden change in direction could send it back toward the soldiers who released it. In some cases, armies accidentally poisoned their own men. Think about that. Weapons so dangerous, they couldn't even be controlled. Yet they were still used. Again and again. By the end of the war, chemical weapons had injured more than 1 million soldiers. But numbers don't show the true suffering. Many survivors were left with permanent damage. Some lost their eyesight forever. Others had lungs so badly damaged that even breathing became a lifelong struggle. Many were left with severe burns and scars across their bodies. Faces were disfigured beyond recognition. Some soldiers had to wear masks just to appear in public. These men were often called the living dead. Because even though they survived the war, their lives were never the same. And the psychological damage was just as devastating. Imagine living every day knowing that the air around you could suddenly become deadly. Imagine hearing a warning and having only seconds to save your life. Imagine watching your fellow soldiers collapse, unable to help them. This kind of fear never truly leaves. War had always been violent. But now, it had become something else. Something invisible. Something unpredictable. Something terrifying. And here comes the most shocking fact of all. Even after the world saw the horrifying effects of chemical weapons, they were not immediately banned. Despite the suffering, despite the injuries, despite the fear, they continued to be used throughout the war. Why? Because they worked. They created panic. They forced soldiers out of trenches. They gave armies an advantage in a war where every small gain mattered. In war, effectiveness often mattered more than humanity. It wasn't until after the war ended that the world finally took action. In 1925, countries signed the Geneva Protocol, banning the use of chemical and biological weapons. But by then, the damage had already been done. Millions had suffered. Countless lives had been permanently changed. And the world had crossed a line that could never truly be uncrossed. World War I showed how far humanity was willing to go in order to win. It showed that even the air we breathe could be turned into a weapon. And it left behind a question that still matters today. Just because we can create something, does that mean we should use it? Even now, chemical weapons remain one of the most feared tools of war. Not just because they kill, but because of how they kill. Slowly. Painfully. Unpredictably. The legacy of World War I is not just in its battles or borders. It's in the lessons it left behind. Lessons about power. About science, and about the limits of human morality. Because once humanity crosses a line like this, it can never truly go back. Even after everything, the suffering, the pain, the millions affected, you would expect the world to learn its lesson immediately. But history doesn't work that way. When World War I finally ended in 1918, the world was exhausted. Entire cities were destroyed. Empires had collapsed. Families were broken. And yet, one of the most terrifying weapons created during the war still existed. Chemical weapons didn't disappear. In fact, many countries continued to develop them in secret. Scientists kept experimenting. Governments kept investing. Because deep down, they knew something dangerous. These weapons were effective. That's what made them so terrifying. After the war, soldiers returned home, but many of them carried the war with them. Not just in memories, but in their bodies. Men who had once been strong and healthy were now struggling to breathe. A simple walk could leave them exhausted. Cold air felt like knives in their lungs. Others had lost their vision completely. Imagine surviving a war, only to spend the rest of your life in darkness. Some were so badly burned that their faces were unrecognizable. Society didn't know how to react to them. People would stare. Children would be afraid. So many of these soldiers chose to stay hidden from the world. They weren't just victims of war. They were reminders of what war had become. Hospitals were filled with patients who couldn't be fully treated. Doctors didn't yet understand how to heal the damage caused by chemical weapons. In many cases, they could only watch and try to ease the pain. And then there was the mental trauma. Today, we call it PTSD. But back then, it was barely understood. Soldiers would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, reliving the attacks. Some refused to sleep without checking their surroundings again and again. Others couldn't stand even the sight of fog or smoke, it reminded them too much of the gas. The war had ended. But for them, it never really stopped. And still, the most shocking part remains this. Even knowing all of this, humanity didn't completely stop. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 banned the use of chemical weapons in war. It was a major step forward. A global agreement that said, this should never happen again. But there was a problem. The agreement banned the use of these weapons, but not their production. Countries could still create them, store them, prepare them. Which meant the threat never truly went away. It was like locking a dangerous weapon in a box, but keeping the key close by. Over the years, the world would see more examples of chemical weapons being used. Not always on the same scale as World War I, but enough to remind humanity of their horror. And every time it happened, it brought back the same fear. Because chemical weapons are different. A bullet kills one person at a time. A bomb destroys a specific area. But chemical weapons spread. They move through the air. They don't always stay where they're released. They don't always affect only soldiers. They can reach anyone. And that's what makes them so terrifying. World War I was the first time in modern history that this kind of warfare was used on such a massive scale. It showed the world what science could do, not just to help humanity, but to harm it. It proved that progress isn't always good. Sometimes, the more advanced we become, the more dangerous we become. Think about it. The same knowledge used to create medicines was also used to create poison gas. The same scientific progress that improves lives can also destroy them. World War I forced the world to face a harsh truth. Technology itself is not good or bad. It depends on how humans choose to use it. And in that war, humanity made a choice that changed everything. A choice to use something invisible, something uncontrollable, something inhumane. Even today, more than 100 years later, the fear of chemical weapons still exists. Why? Because their impact goes beyond the battlefield. They don't just kill soldiers. They leave behind long-term damage. They affect future generations. The land itself can become dangerous. The environment can be poisoned. And the psychological fear, the idea that the air itself could become deadly, that never fully disappears. This is why chemical weapons are considered some of the most feared weapons in the world, even now. Not because they are the most powerful, but because they are the most cruel. World War I wasn't just a war of nations. It was a turning point in human history. It showed how far people were willing to go to win. It showed what happens when desperation overrides morality. And it left behind a warning. A warning that still matters today. Because the real question isn't just about the past. It's about the future. If humanity was capable of creating something like this once, what else are we capable of creating? And more importantly, will we make the same choices again? That is the true legacy of World War I. Not just the battles. Not just the borders. But the moment humanity realized that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones we cannot see. By the time the world began to understand the true horror of chemical weapons, it was already too late. The damage had been done. The line had been crossed. And once a line like that is crossed, it changes everything. World War I didn't just introduce chemical weapons. It normalized the idea that war could go beyond physical combat. That the battlefield wasn't just land anymore, it was the air itself. And that idea was dangerous. Because it opened the door to something much bigger. After the war ended, countries didn't just forget what they had learned. They studied it. Improved it. Refined it. Scientists who had once worked on chlorine and mustard gas continued their research. They began to understand chemicals in ways that were far more advanced than before. New formulas were created. New delivery methods were designed. And even though there were international agreements in place, trust between nations was weak. No country wanted to fall behind. So while the world publicly spoke about peace, privately, many were preparing for the next war. This is what makes the story even more shocking. Because the suffering of World War I should have been enough. It should have been a clear warning. But instead, it became a lesson in how to make these weapons even more effective. Think about that. Instead of asking, how do we stop this? Many were asking, how do we improve this? That mindset is what makes chemical warfare so terrifying. It's not just about the weapons themselves. It's about the thinking behind them. A way of thinking where winning becomes more important than humanity. Where suffering becomes acceptable. As long as it leads to victory. And that way of thinking didn't disappear after World War I. It carried forward. Even though chemical weapons were not used on the same massive scale in World War II, the fear of them was always present. Soldiers trained for gas attacks. Civilians were given masks. Entire cities prepared for the possibility that the air could turn deadly again. That fear alone shows how deeply World War I had changed the world. Because once people have seen something like that, they can never unsee it. And even beyond major wars, the legacy continued. There have been moments in history where chemical weapons were used again. Each time, the world reacted with shock and anger. Each time, people said the same thing. This should never happen. And yet, it did. Which brings us back to the most important point of all. The most shocking fact about World War I isn't just that chemical weapons were used. It's that humanity was capable of creating them, using them, and continuing to develop them even after seeing their effects. That's what makes it truly disturbing. Because it forces us to look at ourselves. To ask difficult questions. War is often described as a test of strength, strategy, and endurance. But World War I showed something else. It showed that war is also a test of limits. A test of how far humans are willing to go. And during that war, humanity went further than ever before. It turned science into a weapon. It turned air into poison. It turned survival into suffering. And in doing so, it revealed something uncomfortable. That progress without control can be dangerous. That intelligence without morality can lead to destruction. And that in the pursuit of victory, people can justify almost anything. Even something as terrifying as chemical warfare. Today, when we look back at World War I, we often focus on the numbers. Millions of soldiers. Millions of deaths. Years of fighting. But numbers don't capture the full reality. They don't capture the fear of waiting in a trench, watching a strange cloud move closer. They don't capture the panic of trying to breathe when your lungs are failing. They don't capture the pain of surviving, but never truly recovering. That's the part history books can't fully show. But it's the part we need to remember. Because the real lesson of World War I isn't just about what happened. It's about what could happen again, if those lessons are ignored. The world today is more advanced than ever. Technology has grown. Science has progressed. Nations have more power than they did 100 years ago. Which makes the responsibility even greater. Because now, the potential for destruction is even higher. World War I was a warning. A warning about what happens when innovation is used without limits. A warning about what happens when humanity is pushed aside in the name of victory. And most importantly, a warning about the kind of choices we make. Because in the end, weapons don't decide wars. People do. And the same question that existed back then, still exists today. Just because we can create something, does that mean we should use it? That is the question World War I left behind. A question that still doesn't have an easy answer. And maybe, that's what makes it so powerful. By now, one thing is clear. World War I didn't just change borders. It changed the way humans think about war. Before this war, battles were seen in a more traditional way, soldiers facing each other, weapons visible, danger clear. But after chemical warfare was introduced, everything became uncertain. Because how do you fight something you cannot see? How do you defend yourself against the air? This is what made chemical weapons different from anything that came before. They didn't just attack the body. They attacked the mind. Imagine standing in a trench, already exhausted, already afraid, and then hearing a warning shout. Gas! In that moment, nothing else matters. Not the enemy. Not the mission. Not even the war itself. Only survival. Soldiers would scramble to put on their gas masks, hands shaking, hearts racing. Some would panic and drop their masks. Others would struggle to breathe even after wearing them, unsure if they were truly safe. And then there were those who didn't react in time. Those who inhaled even a small amount. For them, the outcome was almost certain. This constant fear changed soldiers psychologically. War was no longer just about courage or strength. It became about anxiety. About anticipation. About waiting for something invisible to strike. And that kind of fear is different. It doesn't go away easily. Even when there was no attack, the possibility of one was enough to keep soldiers on edge. Every cloud of smoke, every shift in the wind, every unusual smell could trigger panic. This is what made chemical warfare so powerful, not just physically, but mentally. It turned the battlefield into a place where safety didn't exist. Where even breathing could be dangerous. And this psychological impact didn't end when the war ended. Many soldiers carried that fear with them for the rest of their lives. Sudden noises would startle them. Foggy weather would make them anxious. Tight spaces would remind them of suffocating gas attacks. These were not just memories. They were scars. Invisible scars, just like the weapon itself. And this leads to another important truth. The effects of chemical weapons go far beyond the moment they are used. They continue long after the battlefield is quiet. Long after the war is over. They affect not just soldiers, but families, communities, and entire generations. Because when someone returns from war changed, physically or mentally, it changes the lives of everyone around them. World War I created thousands of such stories. Stories of men who could no longer work. Men who could no longer see. Men who could no longer live normal lives. And behind each of those men were families trying to cope with a reality they never expected. This is the hidden cost of chemical warfare. Not just death, but lasting suffering. Now think about this. If a weapon causes this much long-term damage, why would anyone ever consider using it again? And yet, as history has shown, the possibility has never completely disappeared. That's what makes this topic so important even today. Because the existence of chemical weapons is not just a part of history. It is a reminder. A reminder of what humans are capable of creating. A reminder of how far things can go when there are no limits. And most importantly, a reminder that some lines should never be crossed. World War I crossed that line. It showed the world what happens when science is used without restraint. It showed the true cost of turning innovation into destruction. And it left behind a legacy that still shapes global decisions today. Because even now, nations continue to debate, to monitor, and to control the use of such weapons. Why? Because everyone understands one thing. If chemical warfare were ever used again on a large scale, the consequences would be devastating. Not just for soldiers, but for humanity as a whole. And that brings us back to the central idea of this entire story. The most shocking fact about World War I is not just the invention of chemical weapons. It's the realization that humans created something so dangerous that even they could not fully control it. Something that didn't just change the war, but changed the definition of war itself. Because after World War I, conflict was no longer limited to what you could see. It included what you couldn't see, what you couldn't predict, and what you couldn't escape. That is the true horror. And that is the legacy that still remains. By the end of World War I, the world was no longer the same. Not just because millions had died. Not just because empires had fallen. But because something invisible had changed forever. The idea of war itself. Before this conflict, war was already brutal, but it still had limits. There were unspoken rules. Lines that, even in chaos, were rarely crossed. World War I erased many of those lines. And chemical warfare was the clearest example of that. It proved that in the right conditions, fear, desperation, and the desire to win, humans are capable of creating weapons that go beyond imagination. Weapons that don't just defeat an enemy, but break them completely. Physically, mentally, emotionally. And even after seeing all of that, the world didn't instantly become better. That's what makes this story so powerful. Because it's not just about what happened. It's about what it revealed. It revealed that progress alone is not enough. You can have the most advanced science, the most brilliant minds, the most powerful technology. But without responsibility, without limits, without humanity, those same things can become dangerous. World War I was one of the first times in history where science played such a major role in destruction. Chemists, engineers, and researchers were no longer just working in laboratories for discovery. They were working for war. Creating new ways to harm. New ways to control. New ways to win. And chemical weapons became one of the darkest results of that shift. Because they showed how knowledge could be used in the worst possible way. But at the same time, something else happened. The world began to recognize the danger. For the first time, countries came together and agreed that certain weapons should never be used again. The Geneva Protocol was not perfect. It didn't stop everything. But it was a beginning. A moment where humanity, after witnessing unimaginable suffering, decided to draw a line again. To say, This far, and no further. And that matters. Because it shows that even after making terrible mistakes, humans are capable of learning. Capable of changing. Capable of trying to do better. But the question is that enough? Because the knowledge still exists. The technology still exists. The possibility still exists. And as long as it exists, the responsibility remains. World War I is often remembered through numbers, millions of soldiers, years of fighting, massive destruction. But the most important part of its legacy isn't in those numbers. It's in the lessons. Lessons about power. Lessons about limits. Lessons about the consequences of going too far. Chemical warfare was not just a weapon. It was a warning. A warning that when humanity loses control, even the most basic things, like the air we breathe, can be turned against us. And maybe that's why this remains the most shocking fact of World War I. Not just because it happened, but because it shows what humans are capable of doing. And what they must be careful not to do again. Because in the end, the real danger is not the weapon itself. It's the decision to use it. And that decision has always been in human hands.